Good afternoon. I'm Greg McPherson, president of the City Club of Portland. Welcome to a very special Friday Forum marking the kickoff of City Club's centennial year. For 100 years, City Club has been and continues to be where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. Please join me in wishing City Club a very happy 100th birthday. Members and guests are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening or watching on OPB Radio, Portland Community Media, or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are The Standard, Bank of the Cascades, Stoll Reeves LLP, Family Care, and Russell Fellow Properties. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. Please join us for our next Friday Forum on January 15 for digital inclusion and tech equity for Portland, when we discuss how Intel, $300 million plus 2 local coalitions, are positioning Portland to disrupt the face of tech and to usher in a new wave of women and people of color into the tech workforce. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. And now for today's program. With calls by at least one presidential candidate for the exclusion and registration of Muslims in America, Islamophobia has become part of the national conversation. And from anti-Muslim rallies in Medford to street harassment in Portland, it seems that Oregon is not immune. I am pleased to welcome Casey Jama, Executive Director of the Center for Intercultural Organizing, as today's moderator. Born into a nomad family in Somalia, Casey Jama left there when a civil war erupted and eventually found sanctuary in Portland. From 2005 to 2007, as a New Voices Fellow at Western State Center, he trained immigrant and refugee community leaders throughout the Western U.S. Following the 9/11 attacks, he co-founded the Center for Intercultural Organizing, tying actions with the belief that a multicultural, multiracial, and inclusive democracy is both possible and necessary. Casey Jama has received numerous accolades for his work, including the 2009 Lowenstein Trust Award for having demonstrated the greatest contribution to assistance to the poor and underprivileged of Portland. He will introduce the additional panelists. Please join me in welcoming today's guests.
Good afternoon and welcome, and again, happy birthday for City Club of Portland. Again, my name is Casey Jama, and I'm with the Center for Intercultural Organizing. I will be moderating this discussion today. Before I start, also, I want to make this is for me. I came to City Club of Portland first time about 12 years ago, and that first meeting, actually, that's where I met my wife. Right here. It's a wonderful space, and I'm glad that I came back for City Club of Portland. So thank you for that gift. You know, I think for me, so let's kind of go back. We have watched TV, we have seen what's going on around the country in terms of when it comes to the Islamophobia. We seen the discussions and the public discourse that's happening across the country, but also we have to also remember this is not something new. We also remember about when 9/11 happened, many community members experienced the backlash of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sentiment. But going back, and now a decade and more later, we are again experiencing same experience and same surge of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant issues. But also, even recently, I think we know there has been, mosques has been attacked or at least harassed. Some of them armed folks came to the mosques in different parts of the country. Even here in Portland, Ahmadiyya Mosque was actually, after the San Bernardino attack, Ahmadiyya Mosque was actually, protesters came to that mosque. So we're not unique. And I actually remember right after 9/11 happened, I was driving a quite number of Somali women who was trying to start their own association. And I was the only male, so I was driving, giving them a ride as they came into their meetings. And I remember one night, right after 9/11, we were driving and I was dropping off their houses. And they were talking to each other in the background, I hear their stories of how they've been harassed at the streets of Portland, some of them thrown trash out of the window, driving by cars, some of them being called by names, Osama, go back home. And they were just laughing and joking about this. But for me, this was not a matter of laughing and joking. So I invited back to them in my office and say, let's talk about this issue. I have witnessed people who's been fired from their jobs right after 9/11 because of their faith and being a Muslim. So this issue has been ongoing. But also I want a little bit, before I introduce the guests, expand that we also know that this country is in the crossroads. If you look what's happening in the Black Lives Matter, if you look around what's happening on the election cycle, we are at a crossroads time. So I'm really glad to introduce and welcome our panelists today who really will shed a light some of those discussions. So let me start with Professor Kambis Khan Basari, who is a nationally recognized scholar in Islam in America, and a Middle East, joined the Reed College faculty in 2002 after completing his doctoral studies in the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard University. Next, we have Homa Masiad, a lab instructor at the Child Development Center at Portland Community College, PCC, an active member of the Muslim Education Trust Outreach Committee, immigrated to the US from Afghanistan with her family at 9 years old. We also have Wajdi Saeed, president and co-founder of Muslim Education Trust, has worked with a Muslim community as well as the larger community to promote a better understanding of Islam. He is a co-founder of the Interfaith Council of Greater Portland and co-founder of the Arab-Jewish-Muslim Dialogue, among many other organizations that he is co-founder and participated. We have next Nadia Nachim, who is a high school senior at Oregon Islamic Academy, who is active in her school and also active in the community. Please, let's welcome our panelists. So let's start a quick question. I think I'm gonna start Homi and then go all the way to the Wajdi. So we're talking about the subject of Islamophobia. And I think I would like to each one of you take for a couple minutes to kind of a little bit share with us, what is your experience? How are you experiencing what's happening in the community in terms of as it relates to the Islamophobia and what's happening in Oregon and overall nationally?
I think for me, the internet has really affected me the most because it's kind of like road rage, the way I interpret it, because people are behind the computer and they can be really hateful, as you know, and I kind of carry that with me through the day, and that fear. And we were talking earlier at the table that I'm really grateful that I live in Beaverton. I haven't had any incidents that happen, but it's that fear that you carry with you, and it's looking at everything, every experience with this, intensity, and just the little gestures from people that just means so much. Places that I frequent, like Starbucks or the grocery store, people doing the smallest things, showing their support without saying it. It's just so intense. It just makes me want to go and hug them and say thank you. I know you just held the door and said you have a wonderful day, because it's like this connection that you make, the eye connection that, okay, I'm saying this because I know what's going on and what you're going through. It just means tremendous at a time like this. And for me, the fear when I read the hate online, I worry about my children, because they're my babies, and Nadia is my daughter, and she doesn't tell me the things that happened to her. There were incidents in Target where a woman called her a terrorist, and that was a couple of years ago. But I think my fear is for my children. And then that, just thinking about when you read the hate, I'm constantly thinking about how am I going to respond when this happens? Even though it doesn't happen, it hasn't happened yet. It's that unhealthy, constantly thinking when I'm driving, when I'm going to work, when someone gives you that dirty look, when you see, it's that constant, it's draining. And I remember the first couple of weeks after Donald Trump's comments, I had this intense fear of, when I first came to the United States, my parents just sacrificed so much to come here and give us a new life, and we did. I felt like we had the American dream, and now we have the same fears for our children. We're afraid for their future, afraid for their safety. And I think that first week, the first couple of weeks, my husband and I were actually thinking, where should we go? And those were the thoughts that my parents had when Russia invaded Afghanistan. I think life is just going to be different. And, after meeting with allies and speaking to friends, we're no longer thinking about where should we go. We're actually thinking about what can we do to make the change. Yeah.
So if you are joining with us on OBB, for those, you are listening City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I am Casey Chama, the Executive Director of Center for Intercultural Organizing. Here with me today is Professor Kambis and Homa, Wajdi Saeed, and Nadia. So Nadia, you go to Muslim Academy School, and I know many of your friends also might not have the same luck and they might go to the general public schools. What's your experience in terms of going to the Muslim school, but also when you talk to your friends who go to the public schools, how their experience and your experience differ or similar?
Well, having gone to my small Muslim school for my entire life, essentially, I started in 2001. I've had a different experience in schooling because I've been around a community I'm comfortable with, a community I can identify with. And obviously between each other, there's no Islamophobic sentiment because we're all Muslim. But when I talk to people outside, especially people that aren't Muslim, and they talk about what they talk about between each other, you can sense that there's an unfamiliarity with our experience between them, where as an outsider with non-Muslim friends from outside of my little bubble, they throw around 9/11 jokes, and when they turn to me and expect me to laugh at it, and I can't, it becomes uncomfortable, to say the least. And because I've gone to a Muslim school and I've had a different experience and I've been comfortable for 15 years of my life in that bubble, when I go out and there's this other sentiment that hangs like a cloud over you when you're walking around, every incident that happens comes as a bit of a shock. My mom stole my thunder with my Target story, but coming home from a school event, I had stopped at Target to buy a video game, and there was a woman in front of the shelf who referred to me as a terrorist to her son. I was 13 at the time. I just started high school, stressed out about school, all that stuff. I didn't want to tell my mom. I knew she would freak out. She did. I told her 2 years after it happened, and she freaked out, and she was like, "What did the woman look like? I'm going to find her." No, but there's a certain sense of discomfort. I grew up here, I am American. I'm born American. I have always been American, and I always will be American. But there are people on TV telling me I'm not. There are people on TV telling me that I'm something I'm not. And there are people, my peers, that will tell me, look me in the face and tell me, you're the same as us. But there's an undertone to the type of discourse there is between, especially us, high schoolers, that's uncomfortable. It's alienating almost, to a lesser degree. Up until now, it's been white noise in the background for us. I started school on September 4th, 2001, so a week later was 9/11, and from there on out, there's been a different schooling experience for obvious reasons. You know, police officers would come by to make sure that we were safe, kind of stuff. And I was 3 when it happened, so it wasn't at the forefront of my worldview until recently, or fairly recently. But knowing that it's been there all this time, and I haven't been paying attention to it, and now it's so heavy on our shoulders that first there's a sense of, well, it's not my fault, why are you blaming me? But then there comes a sense of responsibility where us as youth, where we're between peers that listen to each other and we contribute to the formation of a new worldview, there's a bit of a burden on our shoulders. So that's my experience.
Thank you. So I'm going to... With that personal note, I'm going to go back to the Professor Gambi. Can you explain to the audience what's Islamophobia? And is there a difference between Islamophobia and being anti-Muslim?
So one of the things I like to always remind people is that when you have phobias, you tend to be afraid of things. So like if you have arachnophobia, you try to avoid spiders, you try not to see them. But people who are Islamophobic can't seem to get enough of Islam. They want to constantly talk about it, and they want, and that requires us to think about Islamophobia in different ways. It's not just fear of Islam, as the name would suggest, but it's actually the attempt to concoct this fear of Islam for other reasons, for reasons of political gain, for reasons of economic gain, for reasons of marginalizing Muslims in Muslim minority communities in places like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and so on. So Islamophobia is not just fear of Islam, but the sort of concoction of this fear of Islam, something that we ought to be afraid of, something that people should be scared of. And if once we begin to think of it that way, while anti-Muslim sentiments have been around in the United States for a very, very long time, Islamophobia is actually rather new. It hasn't been until recently, and I would mark the 2010 when there were the national controversies around the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in Lower Manhattan. That's the time where we actually began to see this sort of national attempt to concoct this fear of Islam as a way of winning political elections during that 2010 election cycle. The so-called Ground Zero Mosque has gone on to be built and is actually operative. No one talks about it anymore because the election season is gone. And that's one of the things that we need to think about that's dangerous about Islamophobia, that it's actually not just about Islam, it's not about a fear of Islam, but it's about an attempt to marginalize a particular community, concoct fear against that Muslim community for other reasons, for gains in the political realm, in economic realms, and in other realms.
So going back to the, again, Wajdi, you've been around in the community as a community leader for many years, and you're the founder and the president of Muslim Education Trust, which recently just opened a fantastic community center in Tiger. And you also engage interfaith dialogue. How is your experience in terms of like even building the center? I know that there has been a lot of social media discussions. In terms of your own experience, what's the work that you've been doing around engaging Islamophobia, and what's your own experience dealing with even building the center? Has been challenges, or what's your experience?
Thank you very much, Casey. First of all, I would like to thank City Council for their invitation and focusing in such an important topic. Hate, and second, I'm really honored to have one of my great students, Nadia Najm, to be in the same panel, you know. Nadia is the embodiment and and the prophecy of our Islamic education that all of us need to remember that when history was misnamed, the Dark Ages, the medieval times, it was cities of light in south of Europe, in north of Africa, in Baghdad, Damascus, Yemen, Cairo, everywhere in Central Asia. So it is very important that, to remember that history teaches us that if it wasn't Islam, the European Renaissance wouldn't have happened. This is something that we need to remember. The second point that I want to remind each one of us, that hate and bigotry is not a new phenomena. It has been, in our history as human beings, that bigotry and racism and hate is a human nature, that when we are ignorant of things, we react in a negative way. In our culture here in the United States, it has revealed itself, with the African slavery, the indigenous people, the Native Americans, the Japanese American experiences, and in Europe, the anti-Jews sentiments, the Holocaust. All of this were created, hand in hand, because of bigotry and hate and fear of others. In a great scholar, an Arab American, and for me to be part of the Arab American and the Muslim American community, a great scholar by name of Edward Said from Colombia, he wrote a fantastic, excellent book. In his book, Orientalism, he traced, this hate and this bigotry because of, certain political interests and economic interests that always put us as human beings in a position that we reveal the ugliest part of our experiences. Another great scholar I need to just to remind is Jacques Shaheen, another great Arab American. His book, Real Bad Arabs, R-E-E-L, Bad Arabs. He said Hollywood have vilified Muslims and Arabs since 1935. 1935 by producing over 250 movies to put us in a very defensive and a very negative experience. For me personally, here being over 30 years or almost 30 years in Portland, Oregon, it has been a most beautiful experiences that each one of us, as Arabs, as Muslims, and as human beings, period, having a wonderful experiences. What really bothers me a lot, my dear Casey, related to your question, is when I received recently, a month ago, with the Paris, tragedy and incident, here a liberal man that works in the film industry sending us an email saying that he wants to be taken out of our mailing list. Here is an educated man, supposed to be positive. I invited him to my class last year, in the leadership, entrepreneurship, engagement class that we teach at the Oregon Islamic Academy, saying such a thing, reacting in a negative way. Yes, there are people that react in a negative way. There are people that wants to vilify, us, as the next enemy. But I think it is very important that the silent majority has to speak because we don't want to repeat history. We are in a better position now that there are a lot of people standing against hate and bigotry against Arabs and Muslims, or any other, the Latinos or the Africans or so many. But remember, it is possible that, history can repeat itself. And the Japanese American experiences can happen. The Jewish anti-sentiment against Jews can happen again. And it is very important to remember that, that Muslims has been in the forefront, in terms of achieving, excellence in every single part, of history. A great Jewish scholar by name of David Westerstein from Vanderbilt University, he wrote recently in a Jewish chronicle, he said, if it wasn't Islam, Judaism wouldn't have survived Christian Europe. If it wasn't Islam, that Judaism wouldn't have, survived Christian Europe. And last but not least, in recent history, in 2006, when the first elected Muslim was elected, to the Congress, Keith Ellison from Minnesota, he said he wants to swear by the Thomas Jefferson Quran. Thomas Jefferson, one of our great founding fathers, he had a copy of the Quran. And look at how many anti-Islamic, measures, Sharia law or Exxon law. It's like Sharia law is like, a law from Mars. rather than a law that emphasized love and respect and human relationship, that it embodied the most important values of Islam, of acceptance of others during Medinan society, during the life of our dear beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, 1400 years ago, in a document called the Medinan Society. And believe it or not, our great founding fathers and also founding mothers, without the support of these founding mothers, there won't be any founding fathers' great achievement in creating what's called
question right now, just for going to the national.
If you let me just finish this, and I'll be happy to.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, a great, elected man by name of Keith Ellison went to swear by the Thomas Jefferson Quran, a great historian and a great professor of law from University of Richmond, Virginia, Aziz Al-Hibri, wrote, he said, U.S. Constitution and the Medinan document that Muhammad composed with the Jewish community, the Arab Jewish, the Arab Christians, the Arab polytheists, the Arab atheists. And he said, is it a history of borrowing or of a borrowing of history? It is very important for us as intellectuals. My concern is with the intellectual, with the progressive mind that are remaining silent in the public square.
Thank you, and I'm going to transition us. If you are joining us, turning into OBB, you are listening City Club of Portland Fridays Forum. I'm Casey Cham. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Intercultural Organizing. Here with me today is Professor Kambis, Homa, Wajdi Saeed, and Nadia. So let me expand the question of just what we talked about in terms of the national perspective. I'm going to turn to you, Professor Kambi. In terms of, as I said earlier, we're in a crossroads situation in this country. Can you a little bit expand that in terms of, is this only happening to the Muslims? Or as I said earlier, what's the connection and broader context of this issue in terms of the national level?
So one of the things is that the Muslim community is incredibly diverse. There are Latino Muslims, there are African American Muslims, there are Asian American Muslims, there are Arab American Muslims, there are Muslims of Caucasian or Euro American Muslims. So it's an extremely diverse community. And when we look at the sort of longer history of the United States and its dealings with xenophobia, nativism, outgrouping of minority communities, scholars who have done this have noticed that there's generally, whenever there's some sort of crisis that shakes people's confidence in democratic institutions themselves, in the democratic institutions by which we live our lives, people have turned to groups, outcasting particular groups that they could then, through which, protect that democratic institution. So there's the idea that, so we can't have Catholics participating in this political system because they're going to destroy it, because they're going to follow whatever the Pope says, that they can't participate in this. Or we can't include women into this system because they may destroy it. We can't include Jews for this reason, Japanese Americans for the varieties, and African Americans for other reasons. And what's generally has happened is that when groups, this sort of sentiment has come across as minority groups, it's been when there have been a significant presence in the population so that they could actually be blamed for problems. And by the time minority groups have become that significant minority, they actually have resources to be able to step back and respond to what's going on at the national level. We saw this again, for example, with the controversy around the Ground Zero mosques, where it was for the first time that we saw American Muslims on national television standing up and explaining to Americans what the First Amendment means, to say, look, the First Amendment gives us a right to build this thing. Let us teach you what the American Constitution says. And generally, when we look back at American history, people have done this. So Catholics began to start Catholic schools as a way of keeping their children away from the stigma of anti-Catholicism. And among Jewish Americans, the Jewish community centers developed in the beginning of the 20th century as a way of creating another type of way of thinking about participation in American society. And through that process, these groups have come to then and teach America more generally that, look, you could trust these democratic institutions, that actually the democratic institutions are themselves transformative and change the people who come here, and that you could trust them. There's been one difference in this, in the sense that when we begin to look at racial groups, that racial groups have not been able to do this, because unlike religious minority groups that could turn to the First Amendment to say, look, let us tell you what America is all about, for racial minorities, the laws were often their problem. Jim Crow was people's problems. They couldn't actually go and celebrate America and the state to be able to say, oh, look, slavery, here we are. This is some aspect of our lives that we could celebrate in a way that Catholics, Jews, or religious communities could come and say we could celebrate the First Amendment. And American Muslims, because they're racially diverse and religiously diverse today, are in this very interesting position that both reflects what we have seen in the past, and in other ways is actually pretty new, because they have to figure out a way of racial assimilation in America. Had always meant that you had to be able to figure out ways by which you could hold America accountable to its own rhetoric and to its own ideals, to say you're not actually applying those things. We're going to hold the state accountable. Religious assimilation often meant you celebrate America and you say, look how wonderful these freedoms that we have are, and we're going to teach everybody how we could also participate in them. American Muslims are in this awkward position of having to square this circle or circle that square, however the metaphor is that you want, because on the one hand, they want to hold the state accountable for wars, for surveillance, for detentions, and on the other hand, there's this attempt to say, like, look, we have these rights, that ways we are able to practice our religion in this country that we want to celebrate, and those things have never been properly squared in American history. And a lot of what we heard from Nadia and Homa about the sort of personal cloud that's over people's shoulders is in part as a result of these things. And there are no sort of clear institutional structures that American Muslims could turn to right now to be able to say, oh, this is the path we could follow. This happened to Japanese Americans. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen again, right? Because they're in this awkward position that's both similar to what other groups have experienced, but at the same time more complicated because of the fact that they're both racially and religiously diverse.
So expanding to that, Homa, in terms of just being, you also teach public institution. So I'm just want to ask you, in terms of what the professor said, expanding, what do you think in terms of the relating this issue into the other movement and the other challenges? Of course, so if you want to just comment about that.
I think, you mean as far as nationally, how?
Yeah, in terms of national, what's happening at the national level.
I think with my own personal experience from working, I work with children, and children are unbiased, and this is where it starts. It's interesting because working in the Child Development Center, wearing a hijab has never, in my experience, been an issue with the children or their families. And I didn't grow up wearing a hijab, and my family, no one in my family wears the hijab. And my experience with the fear of wearing hijab traveling is so tremendous now that I do consider not wearing it, and how people treat you differently with the hijab and without the hijab. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but it's just my personal, I consider myself American. I grew up in New York. And when people talk to me like I'm a foreigner, it's just, I don't know, I break out in talking about television and how I grew up in sitcoms. I'll talk about Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch, and they're looking at me like, and in my head, it's just, I'm processing, how do I let them know? I'm American, I'm like you. When I take off my hijab, I'm the same person. I have the same values. And I think it's that nationally, before it was this underlying, as a person of color growing up, we always face, racism and oppression and things like that. But now that it's like in the upfront, our leaders are spewing some of that hate, it's such a completely different.
So I think we're going to transition a little bit about just talking about issues and the problems, and now we're going to talk about a little bit about solutions. So I'm going to turn to Wajdi now. Wajdi, as we said earlier, you really has been involved a lot of the interfaith dialogue, and so my question is to you, the audience here and those who are listening us on the radio, if you have one solution, what do you think will be the solution? How people, one thing that people can do, or what do you think what solution will be you're going to offer to the public?
Our motto in our Muslim Educational Trust is that, the Quranic verse that says, "O mankind, we made you from male and female and made you into nation and tribes to get to know each other." The best way, to take that fear of each other is by getting to know each other. And since day one, and before that, we established, several relationships, at least from my history in Portland since 1988, that I have attended several events that founded, by our late mentors like Nuhat Tolan, the founding dean of the College of Urban Planning. He and other Jewish members and other Christians, they started what's called the Cousins Club, And then after that, it became, the Arab and Jewish Muslim dialogue. Because a lot of people think that, you remember the moment you mention Jewish and Muslim and Arabs, the moment you think that there is a conflict. Rather than there is a lot of relationship, the conflict is a political economic conflict. The Institute of Christian Muslim Understanding, the Interfaith Council of Greater Portland, that's also a great venues that in the last 20 plus years that we were able, to counter the challenges among ourselves. We, at the Muslim Educational Trust, we have the second Saturday of every month is a monthly forum and a dinner. Tomorrow happened to be the second Saturday. Please join us and come visit our new Cultural and Education Center around 5:30 and have dinner with us. So this is the venues that we need to always build bridges of understanding and look at each other from a human perspective. Human value, that we are all children of God. God doesn't need one son to sacrifice, for all our sins. God is beautiful, God the most compassionate, God is the most merciful. And all of us are the children of God, and we are in the image of God. And the best among us is the one that is conscious. Consciousness in Islam means to be loving God and love the children and the creation of God. So this kind of events, it's very important, the Institute for Christian Muslim Understanding, the Arab and Jewish Muslim Dialogue. And also remember that there are a lot of good people that have stood up, against Islamophobia, Jews for Islamophobia, or against Islamophobia, the Jewish Voice for Peace, the Pew Trust, the Gallup Trust, the Georgetown, Institute, and so many individuals that have really lent a hand, The Japanese American, after 9/11, they are the first one to extend hands of understanding and support. So this bridges of understanding is here in Portland, and you just need to Google, and you will get the answer.
So if you join in with us, OBB, you are listening City Club of Portland, Friday Forum. I'm Casey Chama of the Center for Intercultural Organizing. Here with me, Professor Cambus, Homa, Wajdi, and Nadia. So coming back to Nadia, for you, in terms of just being a youth, what do you think will be, if you hear, if there's a youth listening to you, what will be one solution or suggestion that they can do to combat Islamophobia?
Personally, I enjoy the company of people that are just like me, and obviously, it's a bit uncomfortable branching out. I think Ron Silver is here. We went to the Beth Israel congregation here in Portland for, giving a presentation on Islam, listening to them and their experiences, and a little bit about what it's like to be Jewish. And It was planned to be this, mingling of teenagers, youth, interacting. We're very uncomfortable with branching out. At least I know us, since we see each other every day. Our high school is 17 kids, and we see the same 17 kids every day. So we kind of went and we looked at each other for half an hour and looked at each other for another half an hour. But the intention was there. We need to talk to each other a little bit more, like what she talked about. There is a word we throw around a lot at school, positive integration. It's his favorite word. A lot of moderate Muslims in the US especially are uncomfortable with talking to other people because there's not only a Islamophobia towards us, I wouldn't call it a fear, more like xenophobia. There's that towards us, and so because of that, we feel that other people will react badly if we reach out to them, so we keep to ourselves. And there are a lot of people reaching out to us, but there are also a lot of people keeping to themselves too. But then we blame them for our problems, and they blame us for their problems, and neither of us do anything to fix it. And then it becomes this vicious cycle of mistrust that's really hard to break. There is another thing, though, is that the youth, at least what I've seen personally from my experience, is that we're more inclined to accept a new idea. That's nothing against older people. You guys are not that old. But, but when I talk to a friend, say, I have a friend that goes to Franklin. She's not Muslim. And I explain to her, when I go out and I'm wearing hijab, the looks I get sometimes are a little bit different. And she says, different how? And I don't know how to explain it because she won't recognize what I feel, but she wants to listen. And that's comforting. So when I do talk about my experience and I know there are people listening, then that's a new bridge built. And when that person wants to talk to me about how they can help, that's another bridge built. And now there's a two-way road of how we can fix the problem. And as that network expands, the sentiment diminishes.
So I'm going to go turn to Professor Kambi, just a minute or two. You talked about the national issue also. Sometimes this issue can be really complex and big, and people feel like hopeless. If you can offer one thing that people can do, as I said earlier, can you suggest one thing?
So I'm a professor, so it shouldn't be any surprise that I'm going to say educate ourselves. A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And this is eminently proven in Islamophobia, that people who read a verse from the Quran and think that they know what Islam is, or talk to a Muslim, or listen to a particular speech, or read a single book about Islam, that think they know what Islam is. But we actually need to educate ourselves to learn about this sort of very complex, diverse world religion that a quarter of the world's population follows. And the other thing I think that's perhaps not so much personal, but that what we could do institutionally is to reinforce the civic and democratic structures of our communities, to make them more inclusive, to not feel that they need to be protected against themselves, not fear that, oh, democracy is going to fall apart because so-and-so participates in it. So we got to keep so-and-so out of it, this group out of it, or that group out of it, but rather believe in democratic structures that seem to have proven themselves over and over again as being transformative, to open them up, to actually allow to hear what Muslims may be able to help address the problems that we're facing both at the local and national level.
So if you're joining with us in OBB, you are listening City Club of Portland Fridays Forum. I'm Casey Chama, with the Center for Intercultural Organizing. Here with me, Professor Kambas, Homa, Wajdi, and Nadia. And I want to offer also myself quickly before we transition to one thing that folks here, at least in the audience and folks in the Portland area can do, is that a group of community members are organizing a forum at the City Hall. It's called Stand for Love, Interrupt Hate. It's going to be held at the City Hall, as I said, January 16 at the City Hall, 1 p.m. in the afternoon. So if you can join, and that forum will be great. Right now, we are going to opening the Q&A, the portion of the program. If you have a written questions, there will be index cards available. Please write your questions. Hold up so the staff can collect those questions. We also would like to take questions from the audience right now. So if you want to just line up at where's the mic? I think we are here on the mic, and state your name, and also City Club members. It's a privilege only for the City Club members. So let's start the questions.
Hi, my name is Robin Castro. I'm a City Club member. And my question is, as someone who is minority and has also struggled in the fight for equality in Oregon, what would you say to include the LGBT community, and how would you reach out to them to help in the fight against Islamophobia?
Basically, and I'll be honest with you, I think the fear of anything is the key. Without really classifying each other as human beings in different classifications, I think it is very important that we have one front against all kinds of phobias as human beings and look at each other as just human beings. And I think that's, in my understanding and my humble understanding as a Muslim, that wake up early morning, to pray that for love and respect of each other. I think it is very important that we build bridges of understanding to everybody without classifications of being, in different racial or sexual orientation or gender or any kind. So we should line up. I remember, when Measure 9, the Oregon Christian Coalition, had, a measure, I remember it's in the mid-90s or late 90s, if I remember, they came and reached to us as Muslims, and I told them, I'm really sorry, and our board told them, we are really sorry, we cannot endorse such measures, because we cannot discriminate against fellow human beings, any kind of choices, it's a personal choice, and we have to respect, because in the Quran, God teaches us not to be judgmental. And this is how Islam created a great civilization from West China all the way to North Africa to South Europe in a matter of 100 years, Imagine how many cultures that came, to the fold of this great civilization. And imagine the existence of Arab Jewish and Arab Christians until now. And imagine, the relationship that we had in this 1,400 years of shared values, because it is based on love and respect and acceptance, not tolerations. And I think that's my honest answer to you.
I think I'm going to invite also, I don't know what wants to add.
If I could just add a quick question. One of the challenges for the LGBT community more generally, I think, is to think about the fact that homophobia and sort of is used as a way of promote hate against Islam, to say, oh, Muslims are homophobic, right? And this also happens in feminist communities, right? So, oh, Islam is against women's rights, and which places both LGBT Muslims and Muslim women in this very awkward position, because they, on the one hand, they want to be able to say exactly that these categories don't apply. On the other hand, they want to ask for women's rights and LGBT rights on behalf of themselves, but at the same time, they don't want asking for those rights to be used as a way of oppressing other Muslims. So this is a challenge for people in the LGBT community to think about. So how do we actually talk about equality and rights in a way that doesn't allow us to have one group asking for rights means that we're going to take them away from others?
I think one comment for me. I think for me, the question I always ask is that, are we fighting for a privilege or are we fighting for justice? I think that's the right question that we ask. And if we are fighting for justice, that means we have to include everybody.
Hi, Georgia Shell, a City Club member. I think that we're so lucky to have this group of people in City Club. And I think that Portland is in itself a bubble of understanding and tolerance and all those things that we here hold dear. But I don't think that that is something that is common across the breadth of this country. And I know that there are a lot of people who do have questions about Islam and are fearful of, for example, homegrown radicalism. I read an article that said that, for example, the imams, about 3,000 of them in India, declared a fatwa against ISIS and other terrorist groups. In addition to what I can do to help the situation, is there any possibility that there can be a concerted statement, I don't know what that form would be, but by Muslim religious leaders against, just in-your-face statement, very strong, against ISIS and terrorism and differentiating themselves from those segments of your religion, which...
Can you have your question? Sorry.
My question is, can there be a statement by religious and community leaders in the Muslim community strongly condemning or declaring a fatwa against ISIS and other terrorists?
So the religious leaders that you talk about, then there's very often very little agreement among Muslim religious leaders and Muslims in general because there's no clear hierarchy, institutional hierarchy in Islam. But one place in which there has been a great deal of consensus, it's historically unprecedented, is in relationship to ISIS. And so if that's not heard, I'm not sure what else Muslims can worldwide, not just to mention the community, could do, because there's no group that has come out. Everyone from Shi'is in Iran, Ibadis in Oman, Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia have spoken against ISIS. There hasn't been anyone who's stepped up to say, like, oh, ISIS is acceptable. So there is exactly what you're asking for. And it's ironic that we keep thinking about ISIS as being representative of Islam when the overwhelming majority of Muslims worldwide had said this is not representative.
Three international Islamic organizations, and they represent mainstream Muslims, which means almost 95%. The Organization of Islamic Conference, which is affiliated, most majority Muslim countries are affiliated with, the European Council of Muslims organizations, the Islamic Society of North America, all of them issued and signed over 180 Muslim scholars. And I was one of the people, as a civic leader, signed in the national conference in Chicago, in Michigan. 180 Muslim American leaders have signed, a condemnation against ISIS. I think it is very important to understand, again, back to Edward Said's book, Covering Islam and Orientalism, there are people in the media intentionally want to isolate the Muslim voice, of condemnation of extremism, and violence. And I think it is very important also to acknowledge, there are people in the media that are trying their best, to have Muslims to have that voice. But the majority of them are not interested when they see Muslims engaging in a peaceful, constructive way. But all these international bodies have condemned ISIS. And it is very important, when we are going to accept that Muslims are like anybody else. When you see a Christian fundamentalist, going, to clinics and attack, these clinics, or Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma bombing, or Jimmy Jones or David Koresh in Waco, Texas, and so many other. Why we don't say, that the Christian bodies has to condemn this? Why don't we see? Why don't we held in the same measure, when Rabbi Kahana, with his total hate sentiments and the Hebron Mosque massacre of 40 Muslim worshipping. Why don't we ask the Jewish community to apologize for such a thing? We should really not equate violence with any religion. Nowadays, here, while we are here enjoying a nice discussion, Burmese Muslims, the Rohingya Muslims, are slaughtered by so-called Buddhist, monks in modern day. But we don't ask, the Buddhists worldwide to condemn such behavior. So let us be, not to be double standards, not to be hypocrites, and accept that Muslims do condemn. Yes, we do have our rotten apples, but so do everybody have their own rotten apples.
So maybe we have one more question. So this question comes from the index cards. What especially can we do, people in the audience can do to improve the situation? I think that's the question. What can the members of the audience do to improve the situation?
I think get to know, if you don't have a Muslim friend, get to know a Muslim friend, a neighbor. Enjoy, the beauty cuisines, of the vast cultures that Muslim represents. And if you don't know, just extend and call and ask that I would like to be a friend of a Muslim. Because the moment we know each other, the moment we love each other, respect each other, and accept each other with all the differences and all the common grounds that we have.
Thank you. I think we're going to have 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask folks in the audience the question. Go ahead, please ask the next question.
Jeff McCarthy, City Club member. Two quick questions, which each of you please identify if you're Sunni or Shia and comment on that proportion in your school. My second question is, in France, I believe the civil law does not allow any headgear. Yeah, I think I'm correct in that. And would that be a way of minimizing Islamophobia in this country?
Can you respond?
Okay, so at our school at the moment, I'm Sunni, if that's part of your question, but I don't think we have any. We have 20% Shia students. I'm not exactly an expert on the numbers at our school. As far as hijab goes, taking it off, you mean? I don't think that would reduce Islamophobia. I think that in itself is an Islamophobic sentiment. There is one thing worth noting. You can't expect all Muslim women to be wearing the hijab. You can be Muslim and not wear hijab. So painting all Muslim women under the same paintbrush as having the hijab on or appearing a certain way or dressing a certain way or speaking a certain way, being a certain race, etc., would be pretty generalizing. It's not exactly the best mentality to have of an entire 1.7 billion people. Yeah. In my personal experience, sorry to cut you off, I don't wear hijab. I came from school. It's part of my uniform, but I don't wear hijab, and my mom does. So we've gone out where I walk in first, and the same person who smiles at me kind of scoffs at her. And that is so uncomfortable. That's my mom, But if you can smile at me because I look different and I sound different and I carry myself differently, maybe, I don't know. It's very, very disconcerting, considering this is my mother.
Next question, please.
Thank you. My name's Maxine Fuchsen, and I think it's not so much a question, but if you want to take away the discussion into some action, we have posters on the back table, and this is from a group called AgainstIslamophobia.org. We're asking people all over Portland to post these posters in businesses and in your window.
What's your question?
AgainstIslamophobia.org. Thank you.
I think we're going to have one more question, last question, before we conclude. So please go ahead.
Kurt Wavering, member. My takeaway from this is that a phobia comes from fear. And could you comment on what are practical or specific ways that we as individuals can do when we sense this fear of the other?
I'm going to actually conclude right there because we are right out of time, but that's really a good question for all of us as audience and members of the community should be thinking about that question. With that said, thank you. I'm going to turn to our president.
We have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. This is Greg McPherson, president of City Club. Please join me in thanking again our guests and Colin Jones of the Friday Forum Committee who produced today's program. We're adjourned.